And we will now pass on to our next speaker for this morning. Thank you, Dr. Wendy Jackson, for being with us. Wendy Jackson is the head of the Avondale Seminary. She is also a senior lecturer in theology and a commissioned pastor. Prior to her theological studies, she's worked as a pediatric endocrinologist. But responding to God's calling, she completed a Master of Divinity and subsequently a Ph.D. in theology at Andrews University. She currently teaches theology and Christian history and has research interests in ecclesiology, Adventist history, and Adventist identity. Her presentation this morning is titled Clothing, as you can see there on the screen, Clothing of the Faithful, a comparative evaluation of the implementation, role, and success of reform dress in 3 19th-century religious movements. So Dr. Jackson will have about 40 to 45 minutes for her presentation. And of course, we remind our attendees that they may submit questions via the Q&A function of Zoom. So Dr. Jackson, the time is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Walter, and also thank you, Dennis, for the invitation to present, particularly the invitation and the opportunity to present something that is not 100% focused on Ellen White, but actually has a wider scope, a scope that really came to my interest in writing another paper for the E.G. White estate, and that is around the role of dress, the reform dress, not dress reform, but the reform dress. And I've noticed as Seventh-day Adventists, we often pass over Ellen White's little phase of using the reform dress, while our critics often spend quite a bit of time on it. And so I wanted to just say, okay, what role did this actually play for us, and how did that compare to some of the other religious groups at the time? When we talk about women's fashion, what we're talking about is something that is very complex and at times contentious. It involves choices driven by both individuals and group ideals. Mid-century clothing was no exception, where women chose their clothing partially based on styles, Parisian styles. And you can see here some of those Parisian styles in the mid-19th century. And you can see that a lot of these were long, bulky dresses which swept the ground, draped over layers and layers of petticoats, hoops, and tightly laced corsets. Together, these layers could weigh as much as 15 pounds, severely limiting movement and physical activity. That such fashion was a health hazard is clearly attested, although often exaggerated. But there is more to clothing than fashion styles and their health significance. In fact, styles can hold unique religious significance, demonstrate virtue, community identity, values, or the need for submission. Even without this overlay, clothes visually communicate information about age, social status, and gender roles, and fashionable 19th century dresses reinforced a stereotypical image of woman as delicate, inactive, and frivolous, highlighting the expectations and boundaries that society placed on gender roles. Reform of such styles began in two separate spheres: closed communities, such as utopian societies, and these often arose out of concerns with the political situation at the time, and private health retreats. But Elizabeth Miller, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Amelia Bloomer would serve as catalysts for a much broader reach of dress reform involving a shortened dress with trousers. It came to be called the Freedom Dress or Bloomer costume after Amelia Bloomer, who revealed the reform to the wider public in her 1851 article in the woman's magazine Lily. Thereafter, the reform dress rapidly came to represent not only physical freedom, but women's rights and suffrage. Nevertheless, social pressure to maintain gender roles, along with accusations that new styles were vulgar, immodest, or too masculine, led to widespread ridicule for those who embraced reform dresses. Consequently, female activists largely discarded the reform dresses within 3 years, by 1854, with health reformers holding on a little bit longer, but ultimately following suit in the 1870s. Although connections between the reform dress and health, and the reform dress and women's rights have been well studied, less consideration has been given to the role that reform dress played in religious movements. This paper focuses on comparing the implementation, role, and success of reform dress styles in 3 religious movements: the Oneida Community, the Strangite Mormons, and the Seventh-day Adventists. It begins with an overview of the reform dress in each community, and then moves to a more comparative analysis and the lessons that we can learn from this saga. We begin with the Oneida community. Sorry, I'm just having trouble moving it on here. Just give me 1 second. The Oneida community was one of the longest lasting and most successful 19th century utopian groups. It was founded by John H. Noyes in 1848 after he converted to Christianity during the Second Great Awakening. While studying at Yale, he came to the conclusion that the second coming of Christ was a spiritual coming in AD 70, and consequently, people were living in a new age where perfection was possible, through strong belief in Christ. He subsequently proclaimed that he no longer sinned. Branded a heretic, his ministerial license was removed, and he was expelled from Yale. Ignoring the ban, Noyes continued to preach, considering that he was divinely ordained to lead. The Oneida community he founded was based not only on his own brand of Christian perfectionism, but also what he labeled biblical communism, which he based on his understanding of both the life of the apostles in the book of Acts and life in heaven. Christians, he contended, were called to duplicate the life they're expected to live in eternity in an effort to counteract sin and to prepare them for the life to come. For Noyes, heaven was a place where there was no selfishness or marriage, property would be jointly owned, and people would live in harmonious relationships. And because of this, he saw no ongoing role for monogamous marriage, even though he himself was married. Consequently, he introduced the controversial practice of complex marriage to his followers, who would all begin to live together in a community house. And this is the big mansion that they moved into. Harmonious relationships in the community, he suggested, required a breakdown of barriers between sexes, and dress reform would help accomplish this aim. He suggested that women ignore fashionable trends and instead wear a shortened frock and pantalettes, similar to those that children wore. His wife Harriet and 2 other prominent women in the community, one of which was a love interest, responded by creating and wearing a costume that was in keeping with this suggestion. And here you can see some of the descendants of this group modeling some of the original costumes that developed in the first year of the association. And you can see that
Wendy,
they are
Do you mind sharing the correct screen? Because we see the application, but not the slides. Thank you.
Oh, my sincerest apologies. Let me try again. It did have it showing and going properly there. Are you seeing it now? Are you seeing the slideshow?
No.
Okay, I'll stop sharing it again. See what happens. Okay.
Yeah, we can now see the application. And if you move the slides in the application, then it should maybe also work.
All right. My apologies. I did have it showing and it was working before. Are you still seeing that? Still seeing the slides?
It's the application, but we don't see the slides. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let me try just one more time.
Sorry.
Keep sharing the slide and it keeps showing to the other screen. So let's try again.
Now it works. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, let's get it to the right screen then. Here we go. So we'll just change the screen that I'm looking at the application, the other application on. Okay, so these are the descendants of the Oneida families that are modeling the first forms of this dress, reform dress, that Noyes suggested. And despite some shock, others in the community seem to follow suit in relatively quick time. In the 1849 annual report of the Oneida Association, there was a claim that women say that they are far more free and comfortable in this dress than in the long gowns. The men think that it improves their looks, and some insist that it is entirely more modest than the common dress. It's hard to know how well this represented the actual feeling of the community after looking at this particular picture. It may have simply been wishful thinking or propaganda to encourage more women to wear the style. Noyes did not force women to wear the new dress, nor were there any community rules requiring it. He did, however, have a considerable amount of control over the women in the community, since he exercised the right of first husband to introduce them to Anita's complex marriage ideology. This, in turn, produced a strong bond to Noyes with leverage to influence their actions. And thus, although the initial reaction to the revised dress was mixed, the community seems to have been relatively successful in getting the majority of women to adopt the new costume, albeit with a variety of lengths and styles. Nevertheless, Noyes felt the need to address what he called the dress spirit, the desire to look beautiful with stylish clothing and adornments. And here in the subsequent slide, you see something that is slightly more fashionable, although it still has a shortened dress and trousers. Since the sin of Eve had led both to the institution of clothing and to sin, Noyes considered that women should particularly renounce all pride in it. Evidence of dress spirit was harshly criticized, and something Noyes declared a perfect people needed to overcome. To help them do so, the theme was frequently addressed in mutual criticism sections. In addition, Noyes induced fear by suggesting that decisions regarding dress and hair would determine if a person was saved or lost. The pressure seemed to work. By 1865, Noyes confidently declared that the community was substantially free from the hostage to the spirit of dress. The resistance, however, was never totally subsided and would strengthen with the next generation who did not have the same loyalty to him or the same connections with his ideology. By 1879, many females were once again dressing in the latest fashion. The Anita paper, The Circular, outlined 4 reasons to adopt the reform dress: health, comfort, convenience, and economy. But these did not match the underlying concerns of Noyes. While Noyes believed women's health would be improved by adoption of comfortable and non-restrictive styles of dress, this was not his main motivation. Dress reform was crucial for the community to live out its perfectionist and biblical communism ideology. Minimizing the distinction between males and females was necessary to live out the heavenly relationship ideals. Dress spirit must be crushed because it violated God's words about pride, as well as their loyalty to Noyes himself. Thus, while Noyes was never absolutely commanded the change, the reform dress was necessary to his ideals, connected to salvation, and a sign of allegiance to the group. When statutory rape charges were levelled against him in 1879, he fled to Canada, and as no one wanted to lead the group, the religious community was dissolved amicably in 1881, bringing to an end the reform dress experiment. Strangite Mormons and the reform dress. 19th-century Mormons also encouraged a reform dress for their women. Some female followers of Brigham Young wore what they called the deseret dress, consisting of bloomers and full skirts without hoops, trims, or trains. Followers of James Jesse Strang would adopt a similar style called the Mormon dress, and you can see potential illustrations of these 2 dresses here. Unfortunately, there are no photos that are extant of either style, at least that have been found by most researchers, and so these are based primarily on the illustrations, on the descriptions that can be found. This paper will focus primarily on the Mormon dress of James Jesse Strang, simply because of the availability of information. Strang was a new convert to Mormonism at the time of Joseph Smith's death in 1844. Nevertheless, Strang asserted that Smith had appointed him as his successor, producing a letter to support his claim. While Brigham Young ultimately won the title of successor, and most of Joseph Smith's followers traveled with him to Utah, a significant number of those who disagreed with Young were persuaded by Strang's evidence. Strang would lead his followers to Beaver Island, Michigan, which, as you can see on the map, is a very isolated island. And here he chose simply because it was a place isolated enough he could rule without oversight. He was proclaimed the King of Beaver Island in a formal ceremony in July 8, 1850, where Strang then became a forceful leader who instituted major theological and social changes without any consultation. Dress reform was one such change. The Mormon costume was introduced after James Strang returned from a trip to New York. While he may have seen the reform dress at Anita during his travels, Strang claimed that the idea arose from the male disguise his then secret wife wore while traveling. By 1852, there was a growing adoption, with one visitor to the community noting that some of the women wore bloomer dresses, but certainly not all of them. He remarked on both the variety of tastes and the length of dresses, which he considered to be shorter than other bloomer dresses that he had seen. Another visitor described the costume as long, loose trousers, gathered closely about the ankles and covered by a skirt that came down to the knees. Strang was critical of contemporary fashion. He noted Extravagance was to be rejected, frequent clothing fads were wasteful, popular styles injure the health, shorten the life, and produce hereditary disease and weakness. However, his biggest objection to popular fashion was the division that it created between those of different social status, clearly differentiating between the wealthy and the poor. Although the adoption of the Mormon dress began voluntarily at Strang's suggestion, by 1855 he began commanding his female followers to actually wear the shorter dress, urging the necessity to conform to the pattern which God has given. Based on this pattern, he ordered women to wear full-length calico pantlets, covered by a matching straight-waisted dress reaching to the knees. The outfit was mandatory for spiritual assemblies and public occasions. Although not divinely commanded for other times, Strang would still require it whenever they lived in community. Only when mixing with those outside were they allowed to consider more fashionable clothing to avoid impertinent observations and ridicule which directly impacted health. There is conflicting evidence regarding whether the dress was generally liked or not. What is clear, however, is that while most women complied, there were some very vocal objectors, including a Mrs. McCulloch, Mrs. Bedford, and Mrs. Wentworth. Significant discord already existed in the community due to Strang's acceptance of polygamy in 1853, and this heavy-handed command regarding women's dress only added to the unrest. Strang, however, became more controlling, determining to compel obedience to the minutest regulations of the church law. On the matter of dress, Strang is reported to have declared, "The law should be obeyed even if he had to wade ankle-deep in blood." This was no idle threat. Both the women who refused to comply and their husbands who clearly did not have enough control of their wives were treated as non-members, subjected to lawsuits, and publicly whipped. Others were ridiculed. Eventually, most submitted to Strang's pressure. The Bedfords, McCullochs, and Wentworths all suffered for their resistance as Strang determined to force them to comply. They refused to relent and resolved to ensure that Strang's power and control was stopped. On June 16, 1856, Noyes was shot by their husbands, Thomas Bedford and Dr. H.D. McCulloch, and died of his injury 3 weeks later, on July 9, 1856. Following the death of James Strang, there was no immediate apparent successor, and most of his followers left Beaver Island, abandoning the Mormon dress as they did so. Which brings us to Seventh-day Adventists and the Reformed dress. In the wake of the Great Disappointment, a group of truth-seeking ex-Millerites under the leadership of James White, Ellen White, and Joseph Bates founded a movement which would become the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Ellen White played a key role in shaping the direction of the group and was recognized by many as having the gift of prophecy. But dress was not an early priority in White's writing or speaking. Nevertheless, early statements highlight her concern about the pride of dress, which stood in the way of becoming more Christ-like. White's first specific discussion of Reformed dress focused specifically on the American costume designed by Harriet Austin. In testimony number 10, she argued against the adoption of this costume on a threefold basis. First, it would cripple our influence amongst unbelievers. As Adventists were already considered odd, drawing unwanted attention would further hinder their witness. Furthermore, she did not want Adventists to be confused with spiritualists, many of whom had adopted the costume. Second, the costume disregarded God's command that women should not wear women's clothing. And third, the costume was associated with the women's rights movement, which manifested ideals and behaviors which were not in keeping with that expected of a Christian woman. Consequently, she was adamant that God would not have his people adopt the so-called dress reform. It is a modest apparel, wholly unfitted for modest, humble females who are Christ followers. Indeed, those who wanted to take up women's rights and dress reform might as well sever all connection with the third angel's messages. With her growing emphasis on health after 1863, fashionable dress also warranted a mention. She condemned the wearing of hoops, long dresses which swept the sidewalk, and any extremes of dress. Instead, she recommended that women simply dress neatly and modestly, and wear their dresses so as to clear the filth of the streets by an inch or two. She would personally encounter the reformed dress of Harriet Austin at Caleb Jackson's health retreat in Dansville in 1864. And surprisingly, in a letter written to the Lockwoods during her visit, she indicated that while the dress of Dr. Austin was too masculine, there were in fact styles used in the health retreat which were, quote, very becoming, that could be adapted and made longer in keeping with modesty. In the meantime, styles most Adventists were wearing could be easily shortened by about 4 to 6 inches while remaining modest. The following year, in the 6th pamphlet of the Health or How to Live series, she repeated her objections to the long, heavy skirts, adding tight corsets on the basis of injury caused to the heart, liver, lungs, and bowels. At the same time, she continued to condemn the fashion of the so-called dress reformers as too short. Extremes were to be shunned, and principles of health and modesty followed in order to present a clear witness of faith. Christians were not to take pains to make themselves grazing stocks by dressing differently from the world. However, they should not change their dress to be like the world if principles of faith demanded it. Although White clearly rejected dressing like a man, she did not rule out wearing trousers. She noted, whatever may be the length of dress, females should clothe their limbs as thoroughly as a male, and that this could be accomplished by wearing lined pants gathered into a band and fastened about the ankles, or made full and tapering at the bottom. Using what she had seen at Dansville as a basis for a more modest dress, she would create patterns that were in keeping with the principles she had seen in vision. Both health and conscience demanded a change, she claimed. When visiting Dansville again later that year, Ellen White donned the costume of shortened skirt and trousers that she had adapted from Dansville patterns. Sorry, it's once again not moving the slide forward. And in this very blurry picture, we can see Ellen White wearing that particular costume on a later occasion. Although it was very similar to the American costume, apart from its length, Ellen White was very careful to distinguish between the two. After the visit, she continued to wear the reformed dress for day-to-day use, but chose not to wear it at meetings, in crowded streets of villages and cities, and when visiting distant relatives. Now, while this might avoid some of the backlash for wearing the costume, it raises questions about her commitment to the style. The crowded streets would seem to be an ideal place to reap the health benefits that she was suggesting that the costume gave, and meetings could have been a place to lead by example, demonstrating the value of the dress to those she was trying to persuade to adopt it. Her stance caused confusion amongst Seventh-day Adventist faithful. Did Ellen White accept the reformed dress or not? In her mind, there was no contradiction, as the new styles of dress were not the American costume that she had previously condemned. But to those looking on, the two seemed very similar and caused some to question her prophetic visions. Testimony 11 was written in 1867 to try and clear up the confusion, but doesn't seem to have done so, given that further advice was needed later in the year to ongoing questions. She claimed clearly God would now have his people adopt the reformed dress, not only to distinguish them from the world, but also because a reformed dress is essential to physical and mental health. Further, it was needed to lessen Adventists' hold on the world. Nevertheless, she noted it was not as important as core doctrines, such as the Sabbath, nor would she force it upon people, especially when opposition might result. However, concerned about the variety of styles adopted, Ellen White personally sold dress patterns to ensure that Adventist women wore styles that were appropriately modest, and advocated a length of 9 inches from the floor. In 1868, she took a more pragmatic approach. Fashionable clothing, she claimed, was inconvenient, especially for housework and traveling. It was unhealthful, and it was immodest in circumstances that required lifting the skirt to get through tight spots. On the other hand, the reformed dress was convenient and comfortable, freeing up the hands while doing tasks and avoiding trip hazards. It was healthful because it allowed women to exercise, breathe freely, protected the limbs, and was also modest because it exposed no more than the feet. Ellen White continued to advocate reformed dress amongst Seventh-day Adventists for a period of about 10 years. But while there was an increased adoption, she met continued resistance. Those taking up the style risked reputation and ridicule, in large part due to the unsavory associations of the dress. Finally, giving up the fight, she complained of the attitudes which got in the way of the change. Fashion has so strong a hold on them that they are slow to break away from its control, even to obey the dictates of reason and conscience. Although some had agreed in principle, they made no changes in their dress, while other women tried to force the reform on their sisters. Dissension and division resulted. Lamenting the outcome, she noted, the burden of advocating the reformed dress was removed, because that which was given as a blessing was turned into a curse. Thereafter, she advocated a skirt and sack, and wisely suggested there must be no new branching out in singular forms of dress. Subsequent comments were restricted to principles such as plainness, simplicity, modesty, practicality, health, and the dangers of fashion, along with importance of dressing in accordance with faith. We move now to talk about comparative analysis. These 3 movements that we have examined have diverse origins and beliefs, and yet they also have a number of similar characteristics. All 3 communities have a significant charismatic authority, a figure who believed that they were either an inspired prophet or a messenger of God, and had a role in the founding of their movements. However, unlike Noyes and Strang, who single-handedly organized and ruled their movements, White did not combine her prophetic role with an ongoing administrative role. John Noyes, James Strang, and Ellen White all considered that dress reform was required, and that for Strang and White that God had communicated information to them about its style, length, or necessity. All 3 leaders were also concerned about vanity and slavery to fashion, and saw this as incompatible with spiritual growth. The reformed styles encouraged by the 3 religious movements were likewise similar, in that they all included shortened skirts and some form of trousers. The needed dress, while attempting to reduce the differences between men and women, still emphasized the feminine waist, but was shorter and lighter than regular fashion, with a recommended length of 2 inches below the knee. The Strangite Mormon costume was described similarly, except that the dress was straight-waisted and came down only to the knee. The recommended Seventh-day Adventist costume was considerably longer, with a recommended length of 9 inches from the floor. It was not to be masculine in appearance, but was to be plain and simple, with matching trousers which could be either straight or gathered. In addition to championing a similar style of dress, there was broad overlap between the roles Reformed dress played in each community, with the emergence of common themes such as spirituality, allegiance, and identity. For the Oneida community, adoption of dress reform marked a clear severing of slavery to fashion, became a test of spiritual growth, suggested an allegiance to the ideology of the community, and a willingness to build relationships in a way that mirrored heavenly relationships. In doing so, it focused on breaking down the walls between men and women to enable them to socialize and work together on various duties. At the same time, however, one scholar has emphasized that the use of children's styles for women's clothing highlighted that women needed to be submissive, something that certainly seemed to be borne out in practice with the leadership of Noyes as he made salvation conditional on such choices. Seventh-day Adventist dress reform was a natural extension of their focus on health, which is connected biblically to the body as the temple of God and to various spiritual principles. However, like the Oneida community, it was also a way to break slavery to fashion and to focus on spiritual growth. The Reformed dress became a way for Adventists to be distinguished from the world by living out their values while evidencing their allegiance to God. Suffering ridicule in the process was equated with suffering for the sake of the cross. Failure to heed White's suggestions on dress reform resulted in her claiming that there was a terrible sin upon God's people because of their failure to adopt a style of dress that was aligned with their faith. Unlike the Oneida ideology, the reform was to maintain the distinctions between genders and their roles. In the Strangite community, the reform was couched in pragmatic rhetoric around breaking down social economic differences and to a lesser extent convenience. However, the role Reformed dress played was not focused around either of these ideas. Ultimately, it served to demonstrate allegiance to the law of God, and more importantly, to Strang himself. Dress reform increasingly became a means of submission and control, with Strang wanting to control every part of the lives of his followers. Success rates in transforming the clothing of the faithful varied considerably. The Oneida community and the Strangite Mormons had a much more robust uptake of their prescribed dress than did Seventh-day Adventists. Devotion to a person provided a strong foundation for action amongst the Oneida community. Although Noyes was a forceful leader, he built loyalty amongst his followers, albeit through his role as a sexual partner. The impact of such personal devotion was further enhanced by the connection of dress reform to the perfectionist ideology of the movement, as well as the crucial doctrine of salvation. This combination meant that there was a strong adoption of dress reform for most of the community's existence. Strang also connected dress reform with key principles of faith by claiming it was part of the laws of God. On the other hand, he built support through fear and punishment, which ensured significant compliance but generated high levels of resistance. His all-consuming need for control, while guaranteeing a high adoption of dress reform, would end up destroying the community, its dress reform, and costing his life. Both the Oneida community and the Strangite Mormons also had the advantage of being located in a single location, and therefore those who adopted what society saw as immodest and vulgar were relatively protected from the outrage around them, especially as they were allowed to wear more fashionable clothing outside the walls of their immediate community. White's success in persuading women to adopt her reform dress would appear to be more limited than either of the other two groups, even though it was advocated by someone of the same gender. While the reform dress seems to have been attractive to young, daring women, White commented in Testimony 11 that not 1 in 20 had taken first steps in dress reform. Even though Ellen White had devoted followers, she did not have all the advantages of Noyes and Strang, in that the Adventist Church was not limited to a single location, she was not its sole leader, and the group had considerably more members than either of the other two groups, numbering some 4,000 at the beginning of her 10 years and closer to 8,000 at the end. Her influence was thus diluted in comparison to Noyes and Strang. Further, the mid to late 1860s brought a strong resistance to her prophetic role, arising from a break-off group in Marion, Iowa, as well as prominent denominational employees Benjamin Snook and William Brinkerhoff. This disaffection was magnified by questions about her prophetic gift arising from the supposed contradictions in her advice on the reform dress. The connection of the reform dress to the health message, which she called the right arm of the gospel, along with the claim of visionary information about the dress, appeared to lack the same power to motivate change as the direct linkage of Strang with God's law or Noyes with the doctrine of salvation. Without significant consequence for failure to adopt it, and without clear association with the three angels' messages, Sabbath, or other central doctrines, women felt free to disregard the call to reform. By the time White started advocating the reform dress, leading society advocates had already discarded it. Indeed, Ellen White first wore her reform dress in the year that the National Dress Reform Association was disbanded. This late adoption meant that reform dress already had many unwanted associations and a besmirched reputation. Women who chose to wear the reform dress thus found themselves subjected to public ridicule. Ironically, this was in part due to the sexual practices encouraged by Noyes and Strang. Together, these factors made it unlikely that Ellen White would succeed in bringing about lasting change. Nevertheless, while discarding the reform dress, she held fast to the underlying dress principles, which continue to undergird denominational views today. So what can we learn from this? The comparative study provides pause for thought regarding attempts to implement church-wide behaviourally based practices. The presented examples have demonstrated the complexity of factors associated with adoption of change, along with the risks of dissension and division when ideas are forced upon people. Even with prophetic support, it's clear successful change works best if the desired change is closely aligned with central doctrines and ideologies of the group. This suggests we should be hesitant to require any practices where there is an absence of strong direct biblical support or clear theological purpose. The negative impact of the reform dress on the Adventist community, especially its mission, also highlights the need to be pragmatic in decision-making. Communities need to recognize that while a suggested behavior might have good reasons for adoption, there are times where the negative impact outweighs the good, requiring an end to the specific behavior while maintaining its key principles. Careful consideration, therefore, needs to be given to the broader implications of proposed changes, especially if long-term behavioral change is intended. Both the charisma of the leaders and the willingness of community members to accept their claims of divinely given authority were important in encouraging change. Nonetheless, these characteristics were not enough to guarantee a high adoption rate of reform dress. How the charismatic leader chose to use the authority, however, was significant. Those who used a more authoritarian approach had a good short-term adoption of the reform dress, but this did not guarantee long-term adoption or survival of the movement. Further, a willingness to allow some flexibility in styles instead of uniformity was greeted with less anger and resistance. In the current environment, where unity is often mistakenly confused with uniformity, and failure to change behavior in line with recommended practice is sometimes associated with sanctions, the examples of Strang and Noyes' misuse of power warns us of the dangers of forced compliance. For the Strangites and Seventh-day Adventists, the reform dress ultimately became a diversion from the core of their mission and spiritual life. The story of reform dress thus serves as a reminder to focus on what is central to our faith, rather than being distracted by enforcing more peripheral matters.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jackson, for your presentation. We will now have a response. So thank you, Dr. Lee, for being with us. I will present her briefly. She is a historian of religion in North America and assistant professor of history at Southern Adventist University. She completed her Ph.D. in religious studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She also holds an MA and BA in history and East Asian studies from Stanford University. Michelle's current book project looks at the history of Sabbath keeping amongst Protestants, Jews, and others in the American West between 1848 and 1920. Her research interests also include gender-based violence in conservative Christian communities in North America. Dr. Lee, you have your 10 minutes for the response.
All right. Thank you, Walter. I hope everyone can hear me. I have my laptop on an Amazon box so that it's closer to eye level. So hello from Chattanooga, and thank you so much, Dr. Jackson, for this paper. I really appreciate it. If I'm looking off screen, it's because I'm looking at my iPad to look at my notes. This is a great topic for interdisciplinary dialogue at the intersection of Ellen White studies, of course, as well as history and religious studies, theology, sociology, and so much more. So thank you. I think this is also a very important topic, as those of us here, many of us here know, this is an important topic, dress reform, that continues to impact the sociology of our church today and our culture. So all the more reason to keep thinking about it. I just have a few thoughts that I will try to go through in some sort of systematic manner. The first one is the 19th century view of the body and of dress. Dress is a way to both fit in and stand out. If you've worked with students, you know that. And I think this paper raises the larger question of why and how dress is a form of critique often in religious communities, and why that most often has involved, at least in the North American context, women's bodies. So larger question for us to consider. In each of the three cases, the dress reformer offered a new form of dress or an altered form of dress based on what was normative. So there is a sense of the norm here, or the quote unquote world. So what exactly, my question is, what exactly were these reformers reading, listening to? What were they, where were they traveling? Were they in the cities? How are they finding out about what was normative? Or was it secondhand through their followers? Or was it an imagined form of fashion that they found particularly problematic? This paper looks at closed societies, but clearly these reformers were watching the world, or at least thinking about the world, quote unquote, in some way. And I think of how Ellen White was a woman of her times, and you provided an example of her kind of interactions with the American costume and Harriet Austin's ideas. And in that moment that you brought up, Dr. Jackson, we see Ellen White trying to negotiate at the crossroads of health reform, which was sweeping not only Adventism, but American society. It's happening in Europe. So the intersection of health reform and divinely revealed health principles, so a very personal experience that she had, as well as practicality. I'm just struck by how practical she is. I was thinking of her comments about how to dress children that you can find now in the 1954 compilation of child guidance, as well as other places. Another question I had was, how do reformist communities, thinking historically here, thinking about change over time, how do these reformist communities or similar reformist communities think about dress or talk about dress after the 1920s, which as Americanists, we largely acknowledge as the turning point in American fashion history and American mass culture, a time when the act of consumption and the act of dressing came on to take new meanings. So that's a question that I have for further research as well. These are mainly just questions for further research and thinking about some of the things that Dr. Jackson discussed made me quite curious. So moving on to a slightly different area for thought, I thought of enslavement and region and class here. How did those things play a role? These three movements that Dr. Jackson looks at appear to be largely lower to middle class movements. So how exactly might things change or perhaps be the same if we looked at, for example, Black utopias at the turn of the century, including those imagined by people like W.E.B. Du Bois or Sun Ra. I thought also of Sojourner Truth's dabble in mysticism in the 1830s in upstate New York, and the book Shopkeeper's Millennium, which my students love. It's a fascinating book. Talks about the prophet Matthias, Robert Matthews, dressing in particular ways as part of his utopian community. And what exactly did he mandate for his female followers? And what did he mandate for a Black female follower like Sojourner Truth? Or was there no comment at all? So again, race, region, and class, I think also America, kind of in line with their cult of domesticity, which for those who are not familiar, were these ideals of purity, piety, submission, domesticity that were held up as the ideal for women. So women were to stay at home and men were to go to work. When you critique those Parisian fashions that this urban middle class was, I mean, almost fanatical about at times, are these reformers somehow implying something about urban spaces, about the city versus country? And of course, we know that the first two cases that Dr. Jackson mentioned were quite isolated geographically or physically. So another thing to think about. Just two more areas of comment. I realize I'm running out of time. The first one, the next one has to do with Adventism in particular. I appreciate you noting the more global nature of this movement, even at the turn of the century. And I was curious, as someone who works in the American West, how did non-white Adventists respond to White's commentary about dress reform? I think of the Chinese mission in San Francisco and the efforts to reach out to Chinese migrants there. Did the issue of dress come up at all? And how did they struggle through the issue of dress reform, if at all? But of course, thinking also of the work in the South, as well as global missions. In these global missional contexts, it seems that we are even further removed from the question of charismatic figures, which was a through line that Dr. Jackson brought up in her paper. So does the element of charismatic figure go away? Is it replaced by the white missionary? And how exactly is dress, if we're looking at Adventism globally in the period that Dr. Jackson is speaking about, how is the question of dress taken differently across cultures? Certainly in my research in Japanese colonized Korea in the early 1900s, the question of dress, and I think this is not surprising to those of us here, is taken as a sign of conversion. At the same time, we see missionaries taking on like the Korean cultural norms and Japanese cultural norms themselves, like taking names in Korean learning that language, sometimes eating that food, sometimes not enjoying that food. So this is a two-way street. There's negotiation happening here culturally, and where does dress fit into all of that? Last area of comment. I would love to know more about the selection of these three communities for comparison in this paper, because there are many mainstream efforts in North America at this time to comment on women's bodies and reform their dress. And it is often evangelicals or even more liberal-minded Christians who are involved in that effort, a quite public effort. I think of Dr. William Acton. He's actually a British physician, but his writings are taken as largely symbolic of American ideas about women's sexuality and bodies, and how those bodies should be clothed. And those are circulating widely in Christian circles that are really bolstering and at times maintaining this cult of domesticity that I mentioned. The temperance movement also is arguably one of the most public and successful moral reformist movements behind abolitionism. And I mean, you couldn't be alive in 19th century America without knowing about the temperance movement. Whether or not you thought they were crazy is another matter. They were a largely evangelical middle class group, with the exception maybe of their leaders who are more liberal leaning. So how exactly are they talking about dress reform and religion in ways that are more public than perhaps the ways that have been mentioned here? And are there fruitful avenues for comparison or contextualization of Adventist dress reform within this larger landscape of religion and reform in the 19th century, in addition to comparison between Adventism or Ellen White and these smaller utopian communities that were quite isolated? It wasn't just reformers who had strict views of dress. Middle and upper class forms of dress that were popularized by publications like Godey's Lady's Book, in sync with the cult of domesticity, were our hallmark of women's history in the 19th century. So I would invite further reflection there as well. Thank you so much for your paper, and thank you for listening to my comments.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. Although our time is up, since this is our last presentation this morning, we can extend beyond the time. So, Dr. Jackson, if there's anything you would like to add at this point, please feel welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much. Those were great questions, and I know it raised a number of questions in my mind too as I was completing the paper. But I would like to just address the selection of those communities. I wasn't looking at dress reform as a whole, but the reform dress. So I was looking at societies that very specifically adopted something that was bloomer-like. And those were a lot more limited than the wider kind of dress reform. So that was the reason I chose those particular communities, not for any other specific reason, because as you say, huge amounts of reform happening all around the place, very different types and very different sets of symbolism happening. But thank you so much. I appreciate it and look forward to seeing that in writing.